So, thank you. Appreciate your time.
It's my pleasure.
Let's start with like how you come to this, how you got to be a man whose focus, a doctor whose focus is on studying this area, why you do it, and a brief tour of the learning milestones that have led you to the edge you're working on.
Okay. Well, I was initially trained as a cognitive psychologist with interest in human development. And I did some early work here at the University of Colorado in perceptual development. And what really moved me towards the field of reading was actually a personal experience with a relative who told me that he was dyslexic. And I'd heard of dyslexia before, but I didn't really know exactly what it was. And he told me that he'd had a horrible time learning to read. He still was not a very good reader. And he said, well, you're a psychologist, and so I think you ought to be able to tell me something about what my problem is. And he had basically 3 questions. He said, first of all, what's wrong with me? Why is it that I'm having this difficulty? Secondly, it was, what can be done about it? Is there anything that can fix it? And his third question was a very interesting one. He said, do you think my children will get it? And not knowing all that much about dyslexia or reading disability at the time, I thought, well, this is really interesting because this fellow is, I know him quite well. He's a very successful businessman. He's obviously very intelligent. He's good at telling jokes. He's very verbal. This is puzzling. Why is he having such a hard time learning to read? So I said, well, that's really interesting. I don't know the answers to your 3 questions, but I'll look into it. And so that's partly what got me started. And right around the same time, there was a group at the Institute for Behavior Genetics, which is affiliated with the University of Colorado. And they were interested in doing some behavior genetic studies of dyslexia. And one of the reasons they were interested in bringing me into this was that I had an eye tracker. I was monitoring eye movements in kids, and I was trying to use that as a tool to understand their cognitive development. But they had heard that maybe there was something wrong with the eye movements in kids that have difficulty learning to read. So they called me up and they said, we're going to put this new grant in to study genetic influences on learning disabilities and dyslexia. Would you be interested in participating? And this was really quite shortly after I'd spoken with my relative who had this difficulty. And I said, absolutely, this sounds really exciting. It could answer one of his 3 questions about whether maybe his children would be likely to get it or not. And so that's how I got started. It was sort of a personal angle and a bit of luck, having other collaborators here who were real experts in behavior genetics. I was not at the time, but I've become much more knowledgeable in the years since I started working in this area.
Good. Yeah. Was your work with eye movements similar to, or in any way that you can briefly describe, paralleling Keith Rayner's work?
Yes, very much so. Okay.
Making inferences about what's going on the inside based on what the eyes are doing.
Right. There was a story out. Some optometrists, for example, were claiming that the problem with dyslexia is the eyes aren't moving properly. And there was a few other researchers around the world that made this claim. And so I thought, well, this is interesting. We better look at it to see if this is actually a problem. And we did look at it. We spent a huge amount of the taxpayers' money doing this sort of work. And what we found was that poor reading generates poor eye movements because people have to stop and look at the words and look back and forget what they were reading. But if you give them material that's at their reading level, supposing you have a 10th grader who's reading at the 5th grade level, would be defined as a person with dyslexia, perhaps with that severity of deficit. If you gave that person then reading material at the 5th grade level, so they would know most of the words at least that they could read, then their eye movements would look just like a normal 5th grader would.
So it was the tail wagging the dog. It had a little bit backwards.
That's essentially true. Yes.
And the eye movements are reflecting what the brain's directing be done in order to get through the confusion to clarity about what it is somebody reading.
That's right. That's right. it's quite interesting that people have picked up on various kinds of issues in reading and have tried to use them from a therapeutic point of view. So there are some optometrists and others who try to train eye movements in poor readers, and they still do this. They still occasionally write papers saying that this is an effective way to proceed. But it's very difficult to do studies of effective training methods. It's very easy to fool yourself. In medicine, they call it the placebo effect.
The Pygmalion effect.
And the Pygmalion effect, that's right. One area that I've been very much involved in besides behavior genetics research is looking at various methods of remediation, because I did want to answer one of my relatives' questions about what can be done about his difficulty. And I think my interest in answering that question was accelerated very much by the information I was picking up on genetic influences in dyslexia, which even in our early research we could see were quite strong. And when I talk about these genetic influences to different groups, often I'd get the reaction that, well, then if it's genetic, then I guess there's not much we can do about it. And of course, that's the wrong conclusion to draw. The genetic influence may imply that there'll be some extra difficulty getting around that constraint, and it may imply that you have to do a lot more for somebody.
Genetics more as one of the variables.
It's one of the variables.
In the developmental readiness or ableness to take off with this, but it's not a digital on-off.
No, that's certainly the case.
The principle is.
That's right. That's right.
That's good.
The relative I'm referring to kept me up all last night talking about dyslexia. He was visiting, and he said, by the way, what have you learned about this? Because many years ago I'd put him in the eye tracker and looked at his eyes, and before the experiment was completed, I told him, well, there's a theory that there's a problem with your eye movements. I'm not sure that's correct, but we're going to do a study and find out if this is the case. And his memory was that I told him that there was a problem with his eye movements, and I had to say, no, that's not the problem you have. And so he said, we didn't get into discussing what the nature of the problem might be, but one of the things he wanted to know was, what have you learned about treating this disorder? And I said, well, the most fundamental thing that I've learned about treating this disorder, at least once you're beyond the very beginning stages of learning to read, is the more you do it, the better you get. And he said, I believe that. He's a fluent reader for somebody who had the degree of difficulty he had to start out with. I wouldn't say he's necessarily above average in speed, but he reads a tremendous amount. He still has a lot of difficulty when he encounters strange names in a book of literature that has unfamiliar names and letter structures. But he, by force of his will, essentially overcame the difficulty that he had, as I think he's done in many areas of life, being a successful businessman. And he feels that he needs to keep reading. He realizes that if he quit reading, of course, then his skills are going to decay quite a bit. And he finds that if he actually slacks off and doesn't read for a long time, he becomes somewhat de-skilled. But he feels personally that this has been the key for him, is essentially to remain active as a reader.
Which means he didn't shame out.
He did not shame out.
Coming to you was an indication of his ability to have enough strength in himself.
That's right.
In other ways to drive through this rather than collapse into it.
Now, he did experience a lot of shame as a younger child, ridiculed by some teachers and some other students as being stupid. He was sent to some special schools. And so it's quite interesting. He still has something of a recurring issue, although I'm not sure this is true at this point, but at least when he told me initially about his difficulty, he recounted some of the most embarrassing moments he had in board meetings, for example, when reports would be passed around and everybody reads them in a minute and he's still there on the first paragraph. This was difficult for him. He wouldn't read to his children because he was afraid they might get his wrong attitude about reading, they'd pick up on his discomfort. So it's
Yeah, that's a dimension that we're really concerned with, is the affective dimension, and
Mm-hmm.
how that not only feels bad, but undermines, the continuity or the
Mm-hmm.
entrainment of cognition on a task.
Right. One of the things I think is really important, or can be a real contribution of what we know about genetic influences in dyslexia, is that while we don't know it about any specific person, because we don't actually have a lock on the gene specific brain or types of genes that are doing this yet, but from the behavioral data with twin studies, which is the primary source of information we have about genetic influences comparing identical and fraternal twins, we know that the genetic influences on dyslexia are quite strong on average. Doesn't mean that everybody's dyslexia is due to genes, but in the groups that we study, about half or perhaps a bit more of the group deficit in reading seems to be tied into genetic influences. And so for some individuals, most of their problem is probably related to genes, and for others, maybe very little or none. So there's a lot of variability, but just giving people the information that some people are going to have difficulty learning for reasons that are not their fault. It's also, I think, a good point to note it's not the fault of the teachers necessarily or the parents. And there's a tendency, I think, to blame. When a child fails, there's a tendency to blame either the child for being not well motivated, or the teachers for not doing a good job, or the parents for not inculcating the proper attitudes, or whatever.
Or the colleges.
Or the colleges, right, absolutely. It does go all the way up to the top. And so I think it's important to recognize that, and this, I think, comes into the issue of self-esteem versus shame, that I find when I talk to groups that are advocacy groups for dyslexia. So there's an organization in the States called the International Dyslexia Association. It's a very good organization. And when I speak to them about genetic influences, they're quite accepting of that because they have many practitioners and dyslexics themselves in that organization who know what a struggle it is. And they know that the kids are really trying hard in many cases. And they know the parents are doing the best they can. So they're very much accepting of the idea that there's some biological constraint that may be related to genetic influences. And they also know that there's a tendency for this to run in families, for example. So they're quite accepting of it. And when they see the evidence, they say, all right, this gives us ammunition, if you will, to bring to bear on the educational system to say, these kids need extra help. It's not their fault for being unmotivated, or not the parents' fault. The education system has to step up and do what's extra, what's necessary. And likewise, the kids involved need to step up as well to be able to do the extra work that's necessary for them to achieve either closer to a normal level or even sometimes exceed normal levels if they work hard enough.
Interestingly, should we shut that door? Here, sounds from outside. Well, I'm going to come back to a definition of dyslexia, so
Sure.
we know that we're synchronized.
Okay.
And then this last point that you mentioned, like in conversations with Wendorf at NCLD, it's really clear that the whole governmental structure with respect to support for people with learning disabilities is on an edge as to whether or not those things are inherent or acquired. Even though it's a fuzzy edge nobody wants to touch, if it's somehow inherent, there's all kinds of money for it. If it's somehow acquired, whether it's the fault, there's no difference in fault of the individual, then it's not something they want to touch because of the extra liability dimensions.
Oh, I see. Well, I mean, I think that if you define learning disability as poor reading, and I really I encourage you to look at it that way, as taking poor reading as a thing that needs to be worked with.
I think it's the nation's greatest learning disability,
regardless of what its origins are. And I'll just give you my guess that in spite of the fact that in the populations of twins that we study here in Colorado, which typically don't include kids learning English as a second language, because we know that learning English as a second language, and also in association with low socioeconomic levels of immigrants, for example, that these are major reasons why those kids are having difficulty learning to read. And we're doing behavior genetics studies. We're trying to look at genetic influences. And so we deliberately restrict our population of twins when we do that. We also don't get a lot of volunteers from very low socioeconomic levels, like in inner city Denver, even if English is their first language. They just don't participate in research typically. That's a change in a new study that we're running right now. But typically in studies that we've done in the past and ongoing studies with older twins, there's a sample selection. The environmental range is constrained. And within that constrained environmental range, genetic influences can be really strong. If we were to expand the environmental range, if we were to include a lot of twins, for example, from inner city Denver, where I think the last I heard their average on the national norms was about the 30th percentile in the Denver school district. There's a lot of variability within the district, but so I take those differences, that poor level of reading performance in Denver, to be a function of the socioeconomic level, English second language, and so on. So if we threw a lot of twins into our sample who are suffering for environmental reasons, poor education or other kinds of disadvantages, then our estimates of genetic influence in our population, our sample that we're working with, would go down, and the effects of shared family environment or school environment would go up, which I think is a good point to make to somebody who's looking at this interview or reading it, that genetic estimates that we have, when I say that more than half of dyslexia is related to, or half the group deficit in poor reading that we look at is due to genetic influences, I say that in the context of a sample of twins that doesn't include inner city Washington, D.C., for example. It doesn't include some of the really poverty-stricken, very poor education areas in our country.
So you've reduced the variables in order to isolate and be able to distinguish in the way that you're experimenting and testing.
That's right.
This influence in the most pure kind of environment you can find it.
That's right. We both, partly deliberately when we exclude kids learning English as a second language, and partly accidentally because people from low SES areas don't participate in the studies. Even if we ask them to, they ignore the letters, and they don't know, they don't feel comfortable perhaps going to the university and this sort of thing. So it's important to understand the results from behavior genetic research in that context. I think people are often concerned that if we talk about genetics, then others will mistakenly assume that poor reading in inner city Philadelphia is due to genetic factors, and therefore nobody needs to take any responsibility for making things better. I mean, it's often, I think some people sometimes use it as an excuse, saying, well, that's the way they are, we don't need to spend a lot of money on them. And this has happened in the past by even well-known political leaders have made that assumption. And we argue, no, that's not the case at all, that there's obvious, really strong environmental influences. Some of those things are studied by Russ Whitehurst, for example, one of your interviewees, has done a lot of work to show that the environment in impoverished situations is quite different for kids picking up basic knowledge about print, the alphabet, early language, for example. And this makes a huge difference in terms of how well kids are going to develop once they get to school.
Right, right. Yeah, the oral language environment, which is so itself inside the environment of the socioeconomic world that the parent, family, home environment's operating in, is the exercise environment that builds certain infrastructure that's the critical stairway on-ramp into reading.
Right.
There is no gene for reading. We're all clear about that. So then it becomes, what is it that the genes are influencing in the structural development of the brain? For example, the phonological processing circuitry, or how is that? What's the pathway between the genes that you are identifying and the structures in the brain that they're influencing, which are in turn affecting reading in a way you can measure? Right.
Well, as you said earlier, that we haven't really identified the genes yet. We're in a very early stage of development in this science. We have methods that can tell us that the genes are located in certain regions on the chromosomes. We have preliminary evidence to indicate that there are some very narrowly localized areas on chromosome 6 and a few other chromosomes where we think we're really close. But as a matter of fact, at this point, we've not actually identified the gene variation.
So when you say inside your sample set that roughly half do have a genetic correspondence or something. You're measuring something.
Well, I'm measuring within our population studies with twins. We can say that about half the variability that defines these kids as poor readers is due to genetic influences, but we can't say at any individual level what that is.
And you're saying that simply because they're identical twins and they share the same genes?
Identical twins share the same genes, and fraternal twins vary in the number of genes they might share relevant to a reading problem. And that's actually how we figure out the genetic influence and how we ultimately will be able to localize the genes by looking at the degree to which fraternal twins share or don't share a disorder, and then say, all right, is the sharing of the disorder related to sharing the same genetic material at certain places in their genome? It's what we call linkage analysis. And it's a very powerful tool for finding out roughly where genes that are influencing this disorder might be residing. And then we start looking at more finer and finer localized positions to actually get down to the specific gene. And the work is really proceeding very rapidly in this area. It's very tantalizing because we have plenty of evidence that there are genes in certain locations in the genome. From our linkage studies, we know there are roughly these regions that contain maybe 100 genes. To get down to the specific gene and its specific variation is our next challenge. But then once we've got that, we have still a lot more work left to do. We have to figure out how those genes vary in their expression in different kids. And how that variation in its expression influences protein production, how that influences brain structure, how that difference in brain structure ultimately influences behavior, and how that behavior ties into reading. You asked earlier, what are some of the basic skills? If we don't have specific genes for reading, what would be the genetic pathway? And what are the sub-processes? Absolutely. Well, one thing that people regularly point to these days is phoneme awareness. I'm sure you've heard this many times. And it's very clear that there is pretty strong genetic influence on deficits in phoneme awareness that are actually even stronger than genetic influence on, say, poor word reading. And I think the reason for that is that it's possible that these deficits in phoneme awareness are really closer to the underlying genetic constraint in terms of brain development, but that also that word reading can be so much influenced by the environment, by how much you read, even if you have a liability that's genetically influenced. And so environmental factors perhaps can end up playing a bit more of a role in word reading than they do on dyslexics' difficulties, for example, in phoneme awareness. But we do know at this point from behavioral studies that the genes that influence dyslexia are the same genes, pretty much, that influence these deficits in phoneme awareness. There's also genetic influences on other things related to reading fluency. So, for example, there are genetic influences on something called rapid naming, which some people consider a second or part of what they call their dual deficit theory of reading disability. There's a phonological deficit, there's a rapid naming deficit. Some kids might have both, some kids might have one but not the other, or varying mixtures of the two. And our behavioral studies tell us that yes, indeed, there's a lot of genetic influence on deficits in rapid naming, and they're to some degree shared with deficits in word reading. And they're not always exactly the same genetic influences as we see with phoneme awareness, which means that it's possible that there's more than one genetic pathway.
Excuse me.
That's all right.
Oh.
Yeah.
Pick it up now. I wind up in that sentence. All I'm going to do is take the battery out of it. Sorry about that.
I think I can pick up where I was. Yeah, right. I'll try to pick up where I was. So the issue then with respect to multiple deficits that can be expressed in different kids in different ways is that there's certainly more than one genetic pathway to reading difficulty. There's many different skills that we have that are not perfectly correlated. They're not phonological awareness and rapid naming have a correlation. It's not a real high one, which then opens up the possibility that variability in the population could be somewhat independently influenced by those two skills, and we have evidence that that's true. Other skills that we've looked at include verbal memory. That's been tied in from a genetic point of view with reading difficulties. Although it's very interesting, the direction of these effects is not totally clear. Once you get out at the behavioral level, your reading problem, for example, could perhaps ultimately lead to a verbal memory problem if you don't have very good vocabulary and you haven't read very well. But we have some evidence, I think, that perhaps constraints on verbal memory in preschool kids, for example, end up later on getting expressed to some extent on deficits in reading.
What you're really finding is that there's a correlation you're making inferences about, right? I mean, you're not able to go to the bottom and say this module is affected by this gene, and here's the.
That's right.
You're saying these behaviors seem to have a correspondence with these
right.
variations in gene expression, and that therefore there's something here. There's some
right.
connection.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, one of the things that we're doing right now, and one of the grant proposal I'm working so hard on right now to finish following up some twins that we first tested when they were in preschool, age 4. And the reason we started testing them at preschool is that we wanted to get a handle on the skills that would later predict their reading problems before they learn to read. Because once you learn to read, that experience starts feeding back on all kinds of things, including phoneme awareness. So illiterate adults in Portugal, for example, were shown not to have phoneme awareness, and once they learned to read, they had good phoneme awareness. So
one of the great myths there is that phoneme awareness is something that we would have if we didn't read.
Well, we would have it at the rhyme level. So the adults in Portugal that were illiterate were very good at doing rhymes. But it seems that awareness at the phonemic level is a bit of an unnatural act. And it's something that comes about largely through engaging yourself with print, because the mapping of letters
the kind of sound distinctions we need to make in order to differentiate oral spoken language conversation is of a different order and granularity than that which we need to make in order to interact with.
That's right. To understand the mapping between speech and letter patterns, it really helps a lot to have a sort of understanding of the phonemic structure of speech. And it's a very abstract structure, so that the phonemes that correspond with a particular letter and the way they're pronounced are really quite different in different contexts. As you know, the code is complicated. But ability to play things like Pig Latin, for example, is one of the measures that we use of phoneme awareness. Or to delete a phoneme from a non-word like prot, say prot.
Prot.
Now say prot without the sound.
Pot. Pot.
Well, it could be pot, couldn't it? Yes. So we ask kids to do these kinds of tasks to assess their ability to play with the language at the phonemic level. It's very much correlated with word reading. It's also, it shares genetic influence. Exactly how it shares, it's not totally clear. But from our preschool studies, we see evidence that even before kids learn to read, we can measure to some extent their phonemic awareness and partly try to teach them actually in that context. And then the genetic influence on pre-reading phoneme awareness is tied with genetic influence on later reading development. So this really brings it into a kind of causal connection that helps us understand what the chain is.
Right. When I talked with Wendorf Lyon and then later Schewitz about this space, it seems from their point of view that 95% of children, start with Reed Lyon and James Wendorf, their research, when you pile it together, seems to indicate that only about 5 to 6%, this is the way they put it, only about 5 to 6% of the children have anything neurobiologically going on that's responsible for their reading. In other words, inherently neurobiological as opposed to something learned.
I don't agree with that.
Okay, good. I want to open that up. I talked to Sally Schewitz, and she says, well, about 20% of the population has dyslexia. Well, what does dyslexia mean? Because if one side of the research is saying 5 to 6% have a biological thing, and 20% have dyslexia over here, then we got to deconstruct dyslexia. How much is acquired and how much is neurobiologically innate?
Yes.
But when you push on all of these people, what they come to is say, well, actually the 5 or 6% is an inference based on how many we can't reach with our teaching. It's not from any kind of bottoms-up analysis of some kind of variation in human brain type that would predict a 5 or 6%. So
yes.
now we overlay onto that conversation the gene work that you're doing.
Yes.
How do we zero in on its dimension?
I think, there's a real problem in defining learning disabilities and dyslexia. And the reason it's so complex is that whatever skill you look at, it could be mathematics, it could be reading, that skill is normally distributed in the population. It's the ubiquitous bell curve that's present in any skill that is very complexly determined, that has many different things contributing to it. Could be environmental, could be quality of the schools, could be mixtures of genes, all kinds of different things. So whenever you have many, many different causes for something, you end up with a normal distribution, which is just the bell curve. So there's a high tail, there's a low tail, and there's this big lump in the middle. And that's how reading is distributed in the population. The real difficulty is saying, all right, if it's normally distributed, there's no clear demarcation whereby you can say, well, if you're below this certain percentile, you're dyslexic. Obviously, if you're below the 10th percentile, let's say you're at the 9th, and that's your cut point. Okay, that person's got a reading problem, but does the person at the 11th percentile not have a reading problem? See, it's a very difficult issue.
Often political arbitrary lines are drawn.
Often political arbitrary lines are drawn, absolutely. And of course, depending on how much money you want to spend on it, you can draw the line further and further out in the tail, so you have fewer and fewer people that you designate for special services.
Which is what's going on.
Sure, it is going on. But I would like to go back to this. Perhaps we can say more about the definition of dyslexia. But going back to the idea that perhaps only 5% of people who have reading difficulty have it for any kind of biological reason. I can't give you an exact percentage because it would be arbitrary for me to say that. But I can tell you that outside of the realm of dyslexia, let's just forget about the low tail of the normal distribution. Let's just talk about individual variation across the whole population in the normal range.
That's my preference.
There's a huge genetic influence on that individual variation. Now, you can argue that once people are in the normal range, it doesn't matter, and we don't want to spend a lot of money on it, and I agree with that. We certainly want to focus our attention on the low tail of the distribution, people that are having the most difficulty. But the amazing thing is that genes seem to influence human behavior, not just in really deviant groups, but outside of those deviant groups as well. Estimates that we're seeing now in several really big twin studies, including one that we are doing here, are something above 70% of individual variation in reading skills, that is how quickly you can read a list of words, is influenced by genetic factors. 70% of the variability in the population is due to genetic factors.
Due to or influenced by? Or?
Well, due to. I mean, essentially what we're doing is we're partitioning out the individual variability into 3 different categories. One is genetic, one is shared family environment, and one is non-shared environment. In fact, twin studies often tell you more about environmental influences than they do about genetic influences. But in the case of reading, individual differences in reading, and of course this is within populations of twins where pretty much everybody's had an opportunity to learn. So we're not throwing a lot of really environmentally disadvantaged kids in these studies, most typically.
Which is where most of the downside of the bell curve is in the country.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think a good portion of that low tail of the distribution is largely driven by socioeconomic issues and poor education.
Well, it certainly corresponds there.
Yes, right.
What it's driven by is the open question.
Yes, that's right.
There's a remarkable correspondence between socioeconomics, language in the home, and reading.
Yeah, so I think biology has influences even in areas that we don't typically think about or worry about. I would read it. Yes.
The question is whether or not, given the other things that are involved, it's a genetic difference that's most making the difference here, or it's a impoverished oral language, or it's a...
Right. And of course you want to know that at the individual level. You want to look at a child and say, well, I know that you didn't have good reading instruction, we're going to fix that. Or I know that you had good reading instruction, but you have a genetic liability, so you're going to have to work much harder.
And these are the strategies that actually compensate for the kind of genetic variation that you're...
Yes. I mean, we can, in terms of making predictions as to whether there's genetic influence, we can look at family history. We can look at the educational.
You can't screen out 2 generations ago's
No.
reading instruction against today's reading instruction as
No.
a comparative to see whether the genes are, in fact, the difference.
Right. No, you can't. Yeah. I mean, we really hope for the future that we will be able to identify specific alleles or variations of genes that we could look at in the DNA and say, all right, this is going to increase this child's likelihood of having difficulty. We'll never be perfect about it because genes always express themselves in the context of other genes as well as the environment. But we could make probabilistic statements that if you have this particular allele, it's more likely that you're going to have difficulty learning, or if you have a combination.
Because you have this particular variation,
yes.
This is the more optimal path to make sure
right.
you don't have a problem.
Right, and if we can learn something about exactly how those alleles influence brain, we might have more specific recommendations beyond what we have right now, is that you're going to have to work harder and practice a lot more. Hopefully we can be more specific about that in the future.
I would think the closer you get to this, the more that it's going to help all the way through early development in cueing the parents to being attentive to the kind of exercises or stimulus that would help work against whatever deficit,
right.
quote, their genes are carrying.
That's right. Yeah. One of the reasons we're doing studies with preschool twins now is not only, as I said before to you, that we want to find out what skills are deficient in kids that later have problems reading that haven't already been affected by reading. Like another example besides phoneme awareness could be vocabulary. As we learn to read and do more reading, the difficult words and vocabulary tests are primarily gained through reading. So if you have a poor reader who doesn't read much, then vocabulary goes down. It could be that genetic influence on reading is really behind what we see later on in life, fairly strong genetic influence on vocabulary. So the pathway may be
so 90% of the vocabulary in use by somebody who's literate and moving on, so to speak, is acquired through reading.
Oh, absolutely. If you look at a vocabulary test, the high scores have to be achieved by being able to identify the meaning of words that you probably wouldn't encounter if you just watched TV or read very low-level materials. Yeah.
I forget the name of the test, but Stanovich brought it to my attention.
The title recognition test?
Yeah, there are TV guides and magazines of all kinds.
Yeah, magazine title, author recognition tests. We use all of those in our research, actually. Yeah. And what we find is that there's genetic influence on print exposure. So monozygotic twins, identical genetically, are more likely to share the level of print exposure on average than our fraternal twins. Fraternal twins are going to be more different in the amount they read than our identical twins. And we also know that your reading skill is correlated with how much you read. So it looks like there's a genetic pathway to amount of print exposure. And we think that the reason is that if you have difficulty learning, you're likely to read less. Instead of more is what you really need to do to reach the same level.
Yeah, which is, but now we get back to that affective problem, the downward spiral of shame. The more that reading feels uncomfortable, the less I want to do it, the less I do it, the more uncomfortable it is.
That's really true, but there's plenty of examples out there, including my relative who brought me into this field initially, of people who work around that through strength of character and good guidance from teachers and family. They realize they have to practice more, that there's a wonderful world of literature out there that if they just withdraw from it, they'll miss it, and they go for it. And there's a number of really strong success stories, even people who've become writers.
Is there any good research on the success stories versus none with the same problem? I mean, I think that a big part of that would be that they have parents that can read, who recognize the problem that help them, as opposed to the other kids that have got parents that don't, that never survived the problem, and therefore think it's fun. Well, the kids having the same problem I did. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm not going to push the kid.
Oh, I think that there's always a genotype environment relationship. In this case, I think it's a genotype environment correlation, perhaps. So if you have a good environment for reading and a family that's very literate, for example, in the Boulder area here, we have many scientists. Some of them are physicists that may have had trouble learning to read themselves when they were kids, but they know reading's valuable. Their kids maybe get some of the same genetic influence, have some difficulty. So the first thing they do is they say, well, I know I was able to do it, but it was hard, and let's see if we can find a tutor. A kid growing up in an economic environment where they don't have the money for the tutors or even a notion of the possibility that that could help, they're not going to do it. Yeah.
Just like any other thing, the genes express themselves in the context of how that organism is living.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And
yeah.
We can say certain things that are enabling or disabling. Or,
that's right.
Or some variation that's not as conducive. But ultimately, we have to understand the entire field, the entire context to understand how to take any one of these pieces and do anything good with it.
That's really true. I think the bottom line is you have to be very clear that the genes are not totally deterministic. They may make it more difficult for some kids to learn, but there's certainly things that can be done to mitigate their effects. Although I would add this though. I would say that I think sometimes there are some fairly naive ideas that people have that all children can be above average. You see that expressed somewhat sometimes in the political rhetoric. I think for some kids with pretty strong constraints, genetic constraints, or if not genetic, if they had some kind of anoxia at birth or some kind of environmental impact on their development, they can certainly do better with practice. But depending on the severity of the constraint, genetic or environmental, that they're dealing with, they may never reach a normal level. They may do better, but they should not be thought to fail or made to think of themselves as failures by not reaching some arbitrary particular average level of performance.
Right, and I agree. I mean, that's with respect to the time.
Yeah, 19 minutes.
Good. It's one thing when we talk about this arbitrarily constructed and overlaid bell curve, system that we're measuring people in relation to.
Yeah.
We say, well, yeah, of course we can't all be above average. The system won't allow it.
Yes.
That's one thing. It's another thing to say that it's every child that's put in a situation where we're forcing them to learn to read. It's not an option. It's not basketball. You've got to do it.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
The context, emotional, social, at home, at school, peer pressure, everything else is saying if you're having trouble with it, there's something wrong with you.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, that's one of the things that I know you're trying to work on. I am too.
Yes.
We are too. But that's part of what's going on. And for those children that don't get to a point where the code reading is as transparent as speaking and listening,
mm-hmm.
they're below that. They are disadvantaged by that factor on a huge scale in terms of their cognitive infrastructure, the health of their mind, their ability to abstract, and of course, they're enormously in terms of their opportunities in the world.
Yeah, I agree that it is a significant constraint, but I wouldn't be maybe quite as discouraged about it as you're expressing, because I think, and I'm thinking of my relative and other people with dyslexia that I've known, even though they may continue to be somewhat disfluent as readers, practicing much more than the normal person would be to get where they are. Perhaps the experience of working around that learning disability reflects a certain strength of character that they can apply in many other areas. It's not uncommon to hear of a successful business person, for example, who had real difficulties learning to read and had the
like a trial. Isn't that kind of the cream that floats to the surface for those that are observing in a particular pool? I mean,
yes.
How many people of all the people that have trouble reading? How many rise to the surface to be Tom Cruises or
right.
or whatever that have these champion stories of overcoming?
Right.
How many didn't?
But yes, I think it's really important to note how many didn't. And as you asked me earlier, what are the variables that determine which people are going to overcome this difficulty and rise to the surface? And we talked about one is socioeconomic opportunity, motivation from teachers and parents and so on. That's a very important one, obviously. There may be some other issues as well, perhaps a particular peer group that you happen to fall into. Some people think that's a really important environmental influence. So I think it's important, though, to hold up these examples of success as what possibly can be done. It's not necessarily the case that every child with these kinds of difficulties is going to be able to achieve that level of success. But the stories that these people tell is they had to put a lot of extra work into it. My relative reads a tremendous amount and has to continue reading to maintain his skill, actually. And those stories need to be told so people understand that there are the possibilities. And I think,
we're collecting some of those
yeah.
stories, and we want to create that kind of searchlight, that kind of a lighthouse effect for people that may be paying attention on the periphery and say, okay, it can be done, it can be overcome.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just saying that relative to the, if you were to look at the millions and millions of people that are suffering in some form of not reaching what their life could be directly in relation to whether they learn to read or how well they learn to read. No doubt there's a whole bunch of great heroic stories of people that had the right configuration of family and character and other things going for them to launch through it.
Yeah. I would add something else, too, that often is what people don't like to hear me say, but because we all want to emphasize the importance of reading. It is obviously important. But, there are tremendously successful people who never become very good readers. They achieve success in various walks of life, sometimes even fairly high levels of profession in certain areas like design, for example, that perhaps don't require as high levels of verbal skills. So I know that poor reading tends to consign you to the bottom of the heap in terms of education and socioeconomic level, but I wouldn't say that everyone who doesn't reach some kind of arbitrarily defined level of reading skill is condemned to a life of misery or poverty. There's so many cases where that's not true. That doesn't mean we shouldn't work hard to do the best we can to help people develop these skills.
You're no good if you don't do this.
Absolutely not.
Sure not.
Yeah.
No question.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that. And like the Tom Cruise or like other people from a bit like Charles Schwab, like your relation. And there's many stories like that of people that were heroically otherwise able to triumph and get above this particular issue.
Yeah. And
develop such skills that in their workarounds that they seem to not. And there are people that we've talked to or heard about that even though they've done that, right, they're still to this day, dealing with the shame they had to overcome in one form or another. There's still a shadow on their life because of how they felt initially as they went through it. That affects who they are.
Yeah. I think that it's gotten much better in recent times because the notion of dyslexia as a reading disability that doesn't necessarily reflect negatively on the person as a whole is an idea that's very much out there now. Yeah. Various well-known people have come forward to say I had this difficulty, and so people understand that you're not necessarily lazy or stupid if you have a harder time learning to read, and that's really important. That's very valuable, and it wasn't always known that way. I think you only have a little bit of time left in your tape.
Exactly.
And so there is something I'd like to steer you towards, if you don't mind, if this is of interest to you. I mentioned to you at the beginning that one of the things that has driven a lot of my research is the initial findings of strong genetic influence. And people's assumptions that means that you can't do anything about it. Well, I knew that wasn't true. And so this got me motivated to actually start a line of research that I'm still very much involved with. So at the same time I study genetic influences, I actually study environmental influences by direct intervention, by exploring different ways of treating kids with dyslexia. I explore what the deficits might be. Was there a problem with eye movements, for example? And we found that that was not true. I've looked at other areas as well that people have said are the underlying cause for dyslexia. And there's a body of research that's emerging on this. There's a lot of controversy about it because some groups will grab hold of one particular kind of deficit and say, that's it. We'll fix that one and everything will be fine. I'm sure you've heard this. I'm afraid that this field of research is one of the great embarrassments of the field of learning disabilities. Right now, for example, in Denver, we have a program called the DOOR program that was developed in England based on one study that was very poorly conducted. It's financed by a very wealthy businessman in England, and it involves doing exercises to fix your reading problems. Now, I can't say for sure that this has no effect. I'm sure it at least has something we call a placebo effect. When kids get attention paid to them, sometimes they actually start reading more, and I think that's usually what drives their improvement. And You can do all kinds of things. You can give them medicine, as one doctor in New York did, that said if you give them something that'll cure seasickness, it'll also fix their reading problem. You can put colored lenses in front of their face. You can train their eye movements. A doctor in a white coat, for example, presenting himself as this will help you learn to read. And for some kids, if they get this attention and they actually start doing some reading, so their parents are paying a huge amount of money to fund this sort of thing, then you'll see some improvement. The field of learning disabilities, though, is way behind medicine in terms of understanding the reason for the effects of these programs. Medicine always controls for the placebo effect when it gives a drug to somebody. And the placebo effects are powerful. If people believe that something good is being done for them, they can often be relieved of the pain and so on. And I think likewise, the various schemes to fix deficits in kids often primarily have their influence from this placebo effect. And the state of research in the field is really pretty sad, in my opinion. The number of well-controlled studies is really pretty limited. There are all kinds of issues of conflict of interest when people get behind something and produce a product. And if there's no independent research on that, unfortunately, often research doesn't sell product, marketing sells product. So I don't have a product to sell, but I have experience with research that tells me one thing, and that is that the strongest influence on growth in reading, once you've gotten beyond the initial levels of reading instruction, and let me say at the initial levels of reading instruction, it's very clear the reading wars should be over. It's good to teach kids the alphabetic code rather than having them try to figure it out on their own. Some kids can, other kids will have a hard time. So definitely, let's teach the alphabetic code. It's called direct instruction. Sometimes it's called phonics. But we can't conclude, though, that this advantage for early reading instruction of using these methods is necessarily going to take care of problems in the long run. And I think the evidence is very strong that it doesn't in the long run. There have been studies back in the 70s, for example, in the 60s, first grade reading studies reviewed by Jean Chaw, who showed clear benefits for direct instruction in the first year or 2 or 3. But then when you follow these kids up out into the 4th or 5th grade, you find that the particular method they were taught initially in reading makes almost no difference in their skills. Other things take over. Genes, culture, how much they read, partly driven by genes, partly driven by culture. So when we think we're going to fix the reading problem in the country by teaching beginning reading in a particular way, we're fooling ourselves. Because the effects of culture, cultural background, are you in a reading culture or not? Do you read or don't you read? Do you have some genetic constraint or not? These things are all going to come into play regardless of how you're initially taught to read. When it comes to fixing a learning disability, we just need a much stronger ground of scientific research to really know when we're looking at placebo effects, when we're looking at methods that really do make a difference beyond placebo effects. And while I complain about the quality of the research in this field, I have to say that it's extremely hard to do this kind of research. It's very easy to fool yourself when you're dealing with human beings who will end up doing things for reasons that you don't understand. And I fooled myself in my own research, I confess. But I've tried my best to disprove my hypotheses about what I think is the best way to proceed. I've tried different methods that I really believed in. I thought they had a special kind of catch-it, a special kind of way to get into the child's mind to really change the deficits they had. And unfortunately, and I'm sorry to say this, I've ended up disproving myself. My hypotheses have gone down in flames in a number of cases. And the reason I'm disappointed in that is I'm searching for the key that will actually turn a child's growth rates into a normal growth rate so that they don't have to read or practice twice as much or many more times than that to reach the same level as another child does. I'd like to make it easier for them. But I have to confess that I don't have that key at this point, and I don't think the field in general has this key. I think outside of really working hard, really practicing, getting a lot of feedback, I think there are certain techniques. Reading accurately is really important and not just guessing. And I think that computer technology is the area that I've worked a lot in to actually provide that kind of feedback. So I do studies with kids reading stories on the computer. They get help when they need it for words they can't read, so they get actually accurate feedback as to what the letter pattern is. They get reviews on those words at the end. They get comprehension questions along the way. So they get a lot of structure and accurate reading practice. It's very effective. And it's just as effective in the long run in my research, and I follow these kids out to 2 years. It's just as effective at doing some of these special techniques that are often held up as the magic techniques, fixing phoneme awareness, for example. In my studies, and I think some other studies as well that I believe are also well controlled, the extra fix on phoneme awareness, once you've gone beyond the initial reading instruction phase, doesn't give you any additional advantage in reading fluency later on. It may help somewhat in spelling of regular words. It can maybe possibly sometimes screw you up on irregular words, but I guess my parting shot here is that we have a lot of work to do, not just on the genetic side to understand what those mechanisms are, but we have a lot of work to do this to answer this other question my relative had: is how do you fix this problem? It's one of the most difficult areas of psychology, I think, to be able to do training studies and fully understand where the benefits are coming from that you're looking at. What's the best way of helping kids learn to read? And I would like to see a really strong national effort to put resources into really well-controlled studies of the benefits of different programs and what elements of those programs are responsible for that. Because the amount of money that parents spend on getting their kids to read better in various programs is just astounding, let alone the federal government. Individual families come up with a couple of $1,000s perhaps for some particular program that might be on the market right now. Are they wasting their money? Well, I don't know if they get a good placebo effect out of it. Maybe they're getting something, but they perhaps could do better with a program that actually focuses on reading.
That helps them actually connect with their child in the process of this rather than throwing some system at them.
Right. Yeah.
That's great. You were talking, one of the things that we've done, there's probably 40 or 50.
4 minutes.
All right, that's right. We can be off now. I'm done.
No,
Okay.
so wait, one more thing we need.
Yeah.
Our camera. So we can, I want you to go ahead with what you're saying, but I want to go ahead and get this. Just in a couple minutes, could you mention something about the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading? That what it is,
yes,
when it was formed, why it was formed,
Sure.
and a quick mission, just because I want that.
Oh, sure. Okay. Go ahead with that now?
Yeah, do that.
All right. Well, I've already told you about one of my favorite organizations is the International Dyslexia Association. But the one that I've been most directly involved in is the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading. It's a group of people that have been pulled together from many different areas: neuroscientists, linguists, psychologists, educational psychologists, educators, and they all share a common interest in doing basic, well-controlled scientific research. And this is what I was saying earlier is desperately needed, not just in terms of comparing different methods of reading instruction. That's one area I think is important. But understanding basically what the issues are in reading, what are the cognitive skills that are involved, how best to measure those skills, all kinds of questions that can be asked at a scientific level. That's what this organization is about. And my personal belief is that the real advances are ultimately going to come from really good science. I think the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading is such an organization. One big advantage of it is that it's become a very international organization. We tend to be pretty myopic here in the United States sometimes. We just look at reading problems here and have all kinds of beliefs about what should be done in our cultural context. But sometimes you can learn a lot of interesting things when you look at other cultures and other writing systems, other cultural practices. And we have membership in the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading from all countries of Europe, Australia, many different areas, China. And we bring perspectives from different writing systems, from different cultural practices. Some countries don't start teaching reading until age 7. Some countries, like Hong Kong, starts teaching reading at age 3. We can look at the differences. One of the highest Actually interesting, one of the highest levels of literacy in the world is in Finland. It runs all the competitions. Reading instruction actually starts pretty late in Finland. Sweden is another one that's way up there. Austria is reasonably high. They don't start instruction. They don't even teach the alphabet until the kids are age 7. And they don't have literacy problems any more than we do. So we need to understand sort of a cross-cultural perspective about reading to fully understand what ultimately matters within our own culture. And so that's one of the reasons I value that organization. It has a very international perspective. I'm not arguing that we shouldn't teach preschool kids the alphabet, because in our competitive society, if you don't, the other kids will know the alphabet by the time they get to kindergarten, and your child will be behind. So, the cross-cultural perspective that you might have.
I want you to go ahead with what you're saying, but I want to go ahead and get this. Just in a couple minutes, could you mention something about the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading? That what it is,
yes,
when it was formed, why it was formed,
Sure.
and a quick mission, just because we want that.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Okay. Go ahead with that now?
Yeah, do that.
All right. Well, I've already told you about one of my favorite organizations is the International Dyslexia Association. But the one that I've been most directly involved in is the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading. It's a group of people that have been pulled together from many different areas: neuroscientists, linguists, psychologists, educational psychologists, educators, and they all share a common interest in doing basic, well-controlled scientific research. And this is what I was saying earlier is desperately needed, not just in terms of comparing different methods of reading instruction. That's one area I think is important. But understanding basically what the issues are in reading, what are the cognitive skills that are involved, how best to measure those skills, all kinds of questions that can be asked at a scientific level. That's what this organization is about. And my personal belief is that the real advances are ultimately going to come from really good science. I think the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading is such an organization. One big advantage of it is that it's become a very international organization. We tend to be pretty myopic here in the United States sometimes. We just look at reading problems here and have all kinds of beliefs about what should be done in our cultural context. But sometimes you can learn a lot of interesting things when you look at other cultures and other writing systems, other cultural practices. And we have membership in the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading from all countries of Europe, Australia, many different areas, China. And we bring perspectives from different writing systems, from different cultural practices. Some countries don't start teaching reading until age 7. Some countries, like Hong Kong, starts teaching reading at age 3. We can look at the differences. One of the highest, actually interesting, one of the highest levels of literacy in the world is in Finland. It runs all the competitions. Reading instruction actually starts pretty late in Finland. Sweden is another one that's way up there. Austria is reasonably high. They don't start instruction. They don't even teach the alphabet until the kids are age 7. And they don't have literacy problems any more than we do. So we need to understand sort of a cross-cultural perspective about reading to fully understand what ultimately matters within our own culture. And so that's one of the reasons I value that organization. It has a very international perspective. I'm not arguing that we shouldn't teach preschool kids the alphabet, because in our competitive society, if you don't, the other kids will know the alphabet by the time they get to kindergarten, and your child will be behind. So, the cross-cultural perspective that you might have is not to say that you necessarily can import some of the same lessons from kids learning to read at age 7 in Austria to what you should do with an individual child in this country, because what you should do depends on what the other kids are doing as well. But having this cross-cultural perspective at least gives you a broader idea of what reading development's all about and what constrains it.
You have to process out the apples and pears. I mean, the kinds of challenges involved, depending on transparency of sound letters, the morphemic structure, the context dependency. There's so many other things that are different between these different systems. And
yes.
The alphabet itself is one component. Ambiguities are distributed in the system. are different in English than they are in other systems, even though the other systems have
Mhm.
ambiguities too.
Mhm.
And it's the ambiguity load it takes processing time,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So we may have similar or rankable variations in performance that doesn't necessarily help us solve the problems of helping any one particular group read better,
Mhm.
unless we understand more of the correspondence between the genes of the biology, the environmental influences, and the particularities of the code environment and its challenges that those individuals are going through.
Right. Yeah. So having that range of understanding, I think, is really important. We want to get a grasp on it in as many ways as we can. I'm interested in genetics. I'm also interested in response to intervention. Others are doing fMRI brain imaging studies. That's very hot right now. A lot of resources going into that. So I think that it's really important. And then amongst cognitive psychologists, they're trying to understand the basic mechanisms of the mind that obviously get applied in reading. There are people that work on kind of social context of reading. All of these perspectives are extremely important. And it becomes a real challenge to bring them all together and understand what their overall meaning is. But we won't get there if we don't try. So but it's important, I think, to keep the mind open to all of these different perspectives at the same time. And of course, I have to make that argument very explicitly to people that want to ignore genetics. I think often people are made uncomfortable by talking about genetics because it has a checkered history in terms of eugenics, in terms of something called social Darwinism, which is a philosophy that says that some people are just not fit and they should fall to the bottom of the heap. Nazism, it's definitely in the past had some real difficult connotations and bad things that have happened in association with it. And of course, it's bad if people take evidence for genetic influence as a reason that you don't have to help kids with difficulties. That's certainly a negative thing, and some people take it that way. So I, in my presidential address outgoing to the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading, I said to people that you've always been very polite when I give my talks, but when I look out into the audience, I see skeptical faces. So you've given me an hour now. I'm going to tell you why I think you really need to pay attention and think about these genetic influences. And I tried to relate to some of the reasons they might not want to think about them. They may think of it as a zero-sum game. If you give some credit to the genes, then perhaps if their interest is in intervention and remediation in the environment, it takes away from their interest. What I try to convince them of is that, in fact, what I learned from genetics really tells me that what they do is even more important. If there are genetic constraints, then basically you have to push much harder on the environmental lever to get the results you want. And if you don't fully understand that, if you think at this point there's just some little magic method of instruction that's going to make a big difference in the long run, you're fooling yourself. That if you've got major genetic constraints or major cultural constraints, for example, if you have kids in impoverished preschool environments and you go in and teach them the alphabet, do you think that's going to make them much better readers in the future if they stay in those impoverished environments? The evidence shows it does not. Famous people that do studies with preschool kids, or have done so in the past, have actually produced evidence saying that you can go in and you can actually improve a child's vocabulary by doing special book reading experiences and this sort of thing. Unfortunately, these things, once the child stays in that cultural context, these things don't have very strong long-term effects. And I'm not saying that their poverty or anything like that has anything to do with genes, but what I'm saying is that short-term environmental interventions are not going to cut it if the environmental context remains very bad. If it's a context in which people don't read, they're not going to become skilled readers, no matter what you do in terms of early intervention. And what this means is that our challenge is much greater than what people are often saying these days. They're often saying that we just need to teach in the right way early on and that will fix the problem. It's way more complicated than that. way more serious and way more costly.
Very well done. And you, in the past few minutes, and thank you, Corey, there's been some really great jewels for what we're doing.
Good.
You just connected up with the National Center for Family Literacy's work and a number of others that are trying to get outside the box of these narrow prescriptive tracks that think we just do this and, you know.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, often people who are advocates for just doing this are not totally naive. They also know that there's much more that needs to be done. But I think sometimes they can be faulted, perhaps, for not saying that more forcefully.
Or to the other extreme, which we've actually had expressed towards us, is a fear of sidetracking the momentum that's building on particular channels at this time.
Yeah, I know one channel that you're talking about, and that's the emphasis on direct reading instruction in the early grades. And that shouldn't be sidetracked. That the evidence is very strong that that's the best way to teach reading at the beginning. But at the same time, the evidence says that in the long run, there'll be other constraints that come in after this initial phase of reading instruction. That some kids that have maybe not the ideal direct instruction in reading will ultimately develop pretty good reading skills anyway. And some kids that are constrained by the broader cultural context or genes, even if they have the best early reading instruction, will end up falling behind because they don't read or because their genes are constraining their growth rates. And that means that the initial fix, while that's the best thing to do for early reading instruction, and we should do that, the problem is much broader. And we need to keep our eye not just on that initial phase of instruction, but on building a reading culture where the culture doesn't support reading, or in the case of where there's genetic constraints, finding ways of providing additional practice efficiently as we can. I'm encouraged by the possibilities of computers in that particular realm. And in fact, having just read Russ Whitehurst's interview, I noticed that he also recommended that as a potential avenue. So I very much agree with him about that.
Yeah, I think in the direction Marilyn Adams and others.
And Marilyn Adams is another one who's working on speech recognition, and I think that there's some very interesting possibilities there.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
We can actually meet it. The closer we can meet the struggling reader on the edge of their struggle and help lead them into learning strategies to move through it, rather than throwing at them some assumptive, prescriptive model system, the better we're going to be. And I think all these things are moving towards that.
Right.
But they have to consider all these dimensions you're talking about.
Well, I think there is a fairly simple dimension that to keep your eye on the ultimate goal of more time on task and more efficient time on task in terms of reading. I think computer technology can help with that. Giving kids.
You're not going to take it in the bathtub with you.
No, that's true. You're not going to take it to the bathtub, although I think the technology is getting close. So electronic books, which are essentially in a tablet form, are very much within the realm of technology that's been developed at this point. So they could sit there with a little stylus and hit words that...
My first patent was for an electronic book in 1985.
Oh,
so
my goodness, yes. Excellent idea.
Track for a while. But
yeah.
But the 80% of the population, the majority of the population that's suffering are the least likely ones to have such a device.
Well, you know, if the educational establishment recognizes the extra help that these kids need, and we can't afford to hire a one-on-one tutor for everybody who needs extra help, that's where computer technology comes in with a potential advantage. And, you know, the cost of a book tablet, you know, with an LCD screen, easily could come down below $1,000.
Or you could build one for less than $100.
Oh, and maybe you could. And so the cost shouldn't be prohibitive. It should be far more efficient than having somebody sit with you and give you the help you need.
Designing the value case proposition so it gets traction in the current
Right.
economics of education.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's technology out there right now, even in the commercial market, that supports scanning in books and then putting them on the computer screen and giving the kids support. Kurzweil is one. I should be disclosing that I'm a consultant with Kurzweil. So,
Okay, I've interviewed him already.
have you? Oh, well, that's Raymond Kurzweil, right?
Right.
Yes, the company now he's pretty much separated from. He's a brilliant man.
Yeah.
He's had wonderful ideas, and actually this scanning system and reading machine for the blind is a wonderful creation. Now his company has gone off and is producing hardware and software, mainly software, to do the scanning and formatting the book pages on the screen so that a kid could read them and get help in various ways. And I think that's a very effective program if it's instituted in the right way. And it doesn't happen necessarily to be that particular software, but any kind of computer presentation. But some of the work that Marilyn Adams is doing, for example, that you mentioned, the Soliloquy company has produced some very nice little books for beginning readers that I think they look really nice.
This goes back to one of your earlier points, which is...
I made a mistake, and I didn't park in the thing. I parked at a meter. I need to put some money in.
Well, just run.
But they'll never catch you traveling across the country?
They won't? You think we should just
I'd say
take the ticket?
Take the ticket, yeah.
They won't chase me down?
They won't chase you down.
All right. Good.
No.
Thank you. And we got it on tape that he said that.
I said that. Yeah, you could take the tape to the parking office and
Jojo liked that a lot. Well, what you just described is like the problem with Paula Talal's work, right? I mean, that so many people...
Is this on tape?
If you'd like me to turn it off, I can. If it says something...
Let's turn it off.
Okay, good. Fine. I think it's similar to what you're talking about in England, that say, well, if they just do yoga poses and they make their hands do this and their hands do that,
right,
it'll balance the hemispheres in their brain and they'll be reading fine.
Yeah.
Others that say if they just write the alphabet in less than 40 seconds, and we don't try to read until after they can write the alphabet in 40 seconds, then they'll never have any problems reading. And the list goes on and on.
It's endless.
On.
It's endless, and there's always a price behind it. There's a product to sell, a therapy to be peddled. And sometimes it's motivated by people's theories. I think in many cases a lot of people really believe in the things they're selling. I'm not sure that's true for all of them because there's a lot of money to be made. So buyer beware. And as I said before, I think it's just really essential for the sake of desperate parents and children and the taxpayers that we develop a really sound scientific base for making judgments about what works, what doesn't, how well it works, why it works. And doing this kind of research is expensive. I can tell you I sucked up a lot of the taxpayers' money doing my computer studies. But I think they gave us messages that are important to learn. And I think other people have done similarly expensive research and have come up with really valuable insights as to what works and what doesn't work.
But for example, with Reed Lyon's work, right, you've got something that's allied to an administration and discounted by 40% of the population just by virtue of the fact that it's part of the central administration they don't like.
Oh, I know. People tend to reject things
so
that are
above that with some kind of a,
yeah. Well, you provide the evidence. You do the studies. You try to bring people that are critical into the evaluation process as much as possible so that they can feel that they're a part of it. You try to avoid as much as possible the warfare aspect. And try to bring people together and say, look, we're trying to help the kids. Let's do a study. Let's all agree on the design. Maybe we have some vested interest in terms of what the outcome should be, that we want it to be, but we want to do the test as carefully as possible. Not everybody's going to agree with that, but I think a lot of the people on both sides of the reading wars would jump in and say, yes, let's do that. And, both sides are going to find out that maybe some of their pet ideas aren't going to be necessarily supported. At least not for all kids in all situations. But we need to be willing to take that step of perhaps being willing to disprove our hypotheses. Karl Popper, the great scientific philosopher, said, that's what we're supposed to be about as scientists. We're not supposed to be proving our hypotheses. We're supposed to be disproving them. But that's not human nature, is it? We get ideas and we want to find evidence to support those ideas. That's one of the reasons why it's so hard to do this research. It's so hard not to fool yourself. It's so hard not to set up comparison conditions that aren't different in some other way besides what you think they're different in. So maybe they're dull, for example. And the reason they don't work is because you made them really stupid and dull. It's not really testing your hypothesis. I see many studies like that. It's hard. It's very hard research to do. But we can do it. I mean, I know there's good studies out there. There are particularly experimental psychologists. I'd like to tout my own particular area of training. We're trained to do that kind of experimental work. Control groups are really important in the kind of work we do. Not that we don't end up fooling ourselves a lot of the time. We certainly do. But we are very much trained as methodologists. And so I would like to see a convergence of educators, psychologists, neuroscientists, people putting their heads together to come up with the best kinds of studies. I'm involved in one right now on an advisory board. It's a study that's been promoted by a foundation called the Hahn Foundation. They also call their group Power for Kids. And it's a big study going on right now in I was going to say Philadelphia. It's in Pennsylvania, where they're comparing a number of different commercial intervention programs that have some, maybe not a lot of independent evidence, but have some converging evidence that they have some good effects with kids, at least at the kind of tutorial level. And this is a study that's trying to move these techniques out into the schools, training teachers, especially hired teachers, to actually administer these programs to the kids over about 90 hours in a school year. It's a very expensive study. And they're just in the process of collecting that data now. But the study is directed by Joe Torgerson, who's done, I think, some of the best experimental research in this area. And I think we're going to get some answers. However, I'll have to say that the study is not going to allow us to answer some of the questions I'd like to answer about the specific methods, what it is about a particular method that might make it work better than another method, because this research is so hard to do. There's variation across teachers. Often the programs are big packages, and so if one wins, if one comes out to be more effective, you don't know for sure what components of that make it more effective.
Help you figure out how to amalgamate the best of all of these things.
It doesn't necessarily do so. I mean, I think it's a good beginning in research. I think it's, I'm really glad this study is being done, because it will leave many questions unanswered. Even if it tells us, as I think it will, that putting this extra effort in can make a significant difference, perhaps across many of the programs they're looking at. But once people see that, then they can say, oh, well, it does matter. You can do something. Maybe one program looks a little better than the others in the outcome, but maybe now we can do some experiments to find out, well, what is it? You know, could we make it even better? Once we generate interest at that level, then we can get more science going in that direction. And I think we desperately need more science in that direction. So amongst the big commercial programs now that are out there, there's the Lindemood Bell program. There's the program Scientific Learning Corporation, the Talal program, that are out apparently having great market success. And there's others as well. And I think we desperately need all of those programs to be brought in to be evaluated scientifically for what their benefits are and why they're having those benefits. And then it won't be the old adage that I was once told when I went after research money to do my studies on my computers. I went to a big corporation that has a big office here in this town. And I knew they were interested in educational software. And so I went to them and I said, well, you know, you can use speech synthesis on computers. A talking computer can help give kids feedback while they're learning to read. And they said, oh, well, this looks pretty interesting. Oh, maybe we'll get, I don't know, to show us more. So finally a marketing guy came in, a very high-level executive. And he listened to us for a while, talking about the research we thought needed to be done to support the kind of product that they could sell. And he ultimately said, I'm sorry, but, you know, research doesn't sell product. Marketing sells product. Unfortunately, that's true. And so people aren't always getting what they pay for.
Very rarely, especially in the consumer world, whereas corporations don't behave that way with one another. The consumer relationship is based on manipulating and buying behavior that isn't necessarily connected to performance.
Right.
However, in the final analysis, something that really does stand up and work is going to be easier to market than something that doesn't.
You know, I think the difficulty with this in the area of learning disabilities is that things work for all kinds of different reasons, and marketing is a tremendous force. So, for example, there's a method that was popular back in about 30 years ago, 30 to 20 years ago. I might have mentioned this earlier. It was a method developed by a person named Harold Levinson in New York. He's written a book about his treatment. And his theory was that the middle ear, it gets out of tune. And so if you take meclizine Dramamine type of drug that tunes the little, as he said, the knobs in you know how your television used to roll, right? Well, back in the days, he was on the Phil Donahue show, and he was describing to the audience how what the problem in reading is that your middle ear is out of tune, and we give you this drug, and it brings it into tune, and it stops your visual television from rolling. The audience is sitting there just lapping this up. There were some successful treatment kids on the show who sang his praises. Oh, this is a wonderful thing. This did wonders for me. A number of us wrote to NBC, I think it was NBC at the time, saying, you know, this isn't a scientifically validated, or at least as far as we thought, a scientifically validated method. And we think there's good reasons to believe that there's nothing but a placebo effect here. NBC never responded, but what they did is they reran the show. It was an extremely popular show. I think maybe Bruce Jenner was on it or somebody. There was an Olympic athlete that was on there. So you can have something, you can get almost anything. You can marshal some testimonials for it from people who feel that they've been affected. They benefited from it. And then it's marketing. So for example, right now, the DOOR program in Denver is this program that, you know, you're supposed to do these balancing exercises, and you pay a couple $1,000s for this. It's heavily advertised, and the advertisements are extremely well done. You know, there's all kinds of testimonials, and I think they're even now bringing eye movement stuff into it, for which there's no, in my opinion, looking at the evidence as I have and having done the research myself, there's really no support that that's going to provide any more than a placebo effect. But they can market it, and, you know, there's just no forum, there's no kind of structure set up as there is in the drug industry. There's the Federal Drug Administration, you know, is that what they call it, FDA? Where they do clinical trials and placebo controls and everything. And so, you know, if you're just, people can't...
seal of approval that we don't have.
Right. We don't have that, and it's just ridiculous that we don't have it.
That's because, I mean, I don't want to be that simple, but it cuts back to the core of what drives us, which is stewarding the health and learning, generally, deeply. And then because we socially don't get the importance of that, we don't have anybody watching over this.
Right.
This is patent medicine salesmanship.
Yeah.
Pre-medical establishment,
right.
erecting the barrier to that.
Sure. I mean, I think when it comes to beginning reading instruction, there has been a fair amount of good research done where, you know, there have been good kind of comparisons against direct instruction versus some much less direct approaches, sometimes called whole language. And the evidence is very clear that the direct stuff, at least at the beginning, gives you this leg up. So I'm not saying that there's no research in the field. There is very much around beginning reading, and I think the results are fairly clear. But in terms of dealing with learning disabilities, the many of which hang on after this initial instruction, the research field is woefully inadequate at this point. And there's no, I mean, while there are some good studies out there, there's just no kind of forum set up to present what the evidence is and communicate that evidence to the larger community. So somebody like the DOOR company can come here into Denver and set up a place and put a lot of ads on TV and say whatever they want. And there's just basically no way. In England, incidentally, the people that very much were involved or know the researchers that initially generated this program and know a lot about the study have just screamed. And, you know, in England, people are more broadly aware that maybe there are some problems with this program. In this country, nobody has a clue. There's just really no kind of voice out there that says, wait a minute.
It's analogous to some of the chemistries that our government will let them sell on our soil.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the United States, I think, I don't know if we're any worse than other countries in this respect, but we seem pretty gullible. You know, we're a nation of TV watchers, for one thing. So if somebody flashes something on TV, I mean, the area of dyslexia is just really awful in this respect. There's one scam after another that ends up getting reported on the news programs, including this DOOR program. And there's no intelligent evaluation of the evidence.
But the community hasn't developed a kind of cohesive voice to help work against that.
No, I agree. And, so I am yelling about it. Why don't I do something about it? Well, I go and yell at other people about it. That's what I do. But I also try to do the research.
Sure.
I try to.
I respect and appreciate that. I just mean, like the differences that are coming out there. There's a lot of people making a lot of money by being the current, voice of press interest about dyslexia.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's pretty strange how that behavior looks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Passing on, we happened to interview somebody in Kentucky who's got a study underway who basically says that dyslexia, and they use the flat out language, this is the key to the problem, singular, right? That kind of general sweeping stuff. That it's all about a lack of symmetry between the center of the eyes and the center of the nose, and that difference is causing a skew in the way the brain is processing information.
Nonsense.
And that a pair of glasses, when put on rightly, changes that, because it changes where the things hit in the back of the eye to resynchronize the brain hemispheres and doing the processing and result in this. And they've got big money going into research about this, all the way from Washington, trickling down to get behind it. And kids...
Not through the National Institutes of Health. Where's really? Oh my. Well, if it's a well-designed study, I'm amazed they got funding for it anyway. But, the basic question you want to ask is, so I'm criticizing the DOOR program because I don't think balancing exercises are going to cut it. I don't know that for sure until a well-controlled study has been done. And there isn't one.
Right.
There isn't.
We have to be open to that. And
anyway.
The point is that there are a number of different tribes of thought, all different banners, all gathering attention and still competing for attention and interest.
Yeah. But one thing that does work, read. Practice reading.
Right.
Read accurately.
Then you've got the Engelmans and others coming in who would say, don't read unless you know that you're reading an environment that is so critically controlled, so directly controlled, that you're not making errors, because the errors are snowballing.
I partly agree with that.
Okay.
I'm not saying that it would be bad to read, that you'd actually get worse by reading and making mistakes. But I think that you progress much more slowly if you make those mistakes and you don't know you're making them. I think you progress much more slowly. And I had this discussion with my relative last night. He said, I practice reading, and then when I come to, I'm reading War and Peace or something, and I come to these names I can't interpret, so I just call them Ted or something like that. And I say, well, it's kind of a reasonable adaptation, but it'd probably help if when you come to something you can't sound out very well, find out what it says. And then you'll gradually learn the way these letters correspond to the sounds better than you have now. So I think that it's definitely better to have a situation where you're getting accurate feedback, whether it's a computer that's giving it to you or somebody sitting next to you. I think your growth is going to be more rapid if you do that.
Right, but for a lot of people that don't, what we're saying is to the boys that may not otherwise read, no, don't read the comic books. No, don't read the baseball card system or other things that may interest and draw them into science fiction stories, because there isn't a coach or there isn't a computer.
Absolutely. And I think the evidence is pretty good that as long as they can read a pretty high percentage of the words correctly, they're going to have lots of practice on the words they already know. It's going to make them more fluent. And they'll gradually learn some of the others as well once they figure out the context and so on. So I think just reading practice, even without the special help that I'm suggesting, is going to be beneficial. I'm just saying that the additional help is going to probably increase the growth rates.
A final thing, and then I'll ask you if you have any more wrap-ups. You mentioned earlier about the need to kind of bring these different perspectives into some alignment, and without going through the instructional side, but rather we'll call pre-frame or reframe. In other words, what could kids get? What could they understand? What could we help them? If we could say, if we could get all the wisdom of all the people that were interested and that put their head in this, and we could machine down to, these are the top 10 things we kind of all agree on are really critical.
Yeah.
Right? And we didn't have the kids for 2 years to do it. We had the kids for a couple of hours.
Mm-hmm.
We're not trying to teach them how to do all this stuff. We're trying to pre-frame it.
Mm.
We're trying to orient their coming into all of this
Mm-hmm.
in such a way that they don't feel at fault if they're confused.
Yeah.
They understand something about the messy orthography and
Yeah.
the history of it. They understand something about the challenge. I mean, if we could distill down to some of those things and then wrap that in Hollywood's finest animated feature for the children could have a ride into this that was a different frame of reference inside of them.
Yeah.
Than they're experiencing.
Right. I think you might have to pitch the message differently, depending on where the primary cause seems to lie. So if the primary cause is just lack of instruction, as it is in much of our society, then the solution is pretty obvious. You need good instruction, good beginning instruction. You also need continued engagement in reading, which I think tends to fall apart in many sections of our society after that good instruction. So good instruction itself won't necessarily do it. So that's for somebody who doesn't have any other kind of biological constraint. They just need good instruction and they need to practice reading at any kind of normal level, and they would progress in that context. On the other hand, there are people that, for other reasons, sometimes in addition to the cultural constraints, and these could be genetic or they could be some kind of biological constraint that's related to having had a virus when you're a baby. I mean, any kind of thing that makes learning in that domain more difficult. Then the message to them would be, there are these constraints, you may have one of them, that makes it, and if you show that this kid is slower in learning certain things related to developing print and literacy kinds of knowledge, and you can assess that very easily by various kinds of tests that show how quickly you learn certain things. And that's the kind of research we do actually with our twins. Then you can say, all right, here we have a constraint on growth rate in reading. You're going to have additional support. You may have to practice more. You may have to have the help of a tutor or a computer that will make sure that you're accurate while you're reading to achieve the maximum growth. But you can get around this. In most cases, you can develop a level of fluency where you can enjoy reading and then sort of wrap up with all the advantages that come in life as a result of developing that level of skill. But I think it's also important to emphasize that it doesn't come free. There's no magic bullet, that it's going to take great strength of character to achieve this greater amount of practice, and that they should be rewarded for that. Not whether they actually ultimately become above average, but that they improve significantly from wherever they're at, in that the rewards should come for doing that. Their personal rewards, and virtue is its own reward in that context, but the external society needs to provide those rewards as well. And I don't think it does a very good job of that.
No, it doesn't. Let me put that last point on a somewhat sharper one and see if that engages you or your interest in this. We are actually in the process of working with one of the most awarded, noted animated feature film producers in history, just under Disney in that group. Mm-hmm. And what we want to do is gather up a roundtable, an alliance of the best and brightest people that have put their head in the space of reading and problems.
Yeah.
Have the reading people develop these are the kind of insights, the kind of pre-frames, the kind of things that if kids could kind of have some better reference to this, it would help them later as they go through this.
Yeah.
Then get that kind of sorted out and then work with these. Let's story this. How do we bring some stories so that jewel is implicated in some character challenge over there, and go back and forth until the story people say, yeah, we got a blockbuster success like Shrek 2. Mm-hmm. And the reading people say, yeah, this could really help. And now we've got something that, it's a win-win for everybody around.
Yes. So
we're in the process of getting those stools to spin on that.
Yes.
We've got some pretty nice heavyweights so far on the reading side of the world. Mm-hmm. And I don't ask everybody I encounter, but I wanted to ask you, would you participate in such a thing?
Certainly. Yeah, sure.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else that you want to say we didn't cover?
Well, we've covered a lot of ground. And I think I've touched on most of the things that I wanted to say. Yeah. I don't know if you had any questions for me on, anywhere you want to go.
One of the things I'd like to do, I don't know if you saw this in the Wendorf thing, and I want to do this more, is after we put the text part of this up on the web, and I don't know when we're going to get to that. We're 25 behind growing, but we try to unfold them in a way that will keep our constituency checking us. Is that it usually generates on reflection some new questions. And if you're open to that, I'd love to have an after the fact open channel for dialogue that would be not videotaped, obviously, but where somebody could go to say, here's some questions that came up for us in this. They can go to that and get answers. I become an architect of a distributed dialogue system where we use this more as a frame.
That would have to have a constraint on it. I find that I spend half my life on email these days. And partly because once you develop a reputation for working in this field, there are so many people that have kids with problems that end up calling you or sending you emails.
I'm talking about open channel.
Oh, you're not, no, okay.
Between you and me to fine point some things if they come up.
Oh, sure. Sure.
Right.
Sure.
Anything else from you? All right. It's been a great pleasure.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed talking to you. And, I think your effort's a really good one. You're going to have lots of different perspectives. I already know that from looking at the people you've interviewed. And that's fine. That's fine. Especially if you kind of push this theme a little bit along the way that is my favorite hobby horse, which is to really need more evidence. We need, really basic sound scientific research, especially on intervention. That's really hard to do. Of course, I want to say we need more evidence about genetics as well, because I love that area and I think it's important, and I'm applying for grants right now. So definitely we need more expenditure of taxpayers' money in that area. But
intervention and assessments, because they're inseparable.
Intervention and assessment, definitely. Yeah. Good solid research on it. Take, anything that's going to get out in the public domain and get pushed. And not only do the research, but also set up some kind of forum so that it's just readily available. So when NBC gets somebody coming to them about these, I'm sure these glasses are going to show up they'll be on the networks, so that we can shame the networks into saying, look, you presented this and here's this block of evidence supported by some federal agency that says there's no evidence to support this. If you have that thing,
that makes them responsible. That creates a different reference for
it does. It does. And we really need to push in that direction. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to get hoodwinked by one, I'm not saying these people are dishonest. I think many times they really believe what they do is of benefit to the kids, but I think they often don't know why.
The thing is, it's religious instead of scientific.
I think so. I think it is, even though it has the trappings of science. Unfortunately, science is a human endeavor. And so a lot of things that get published, even in our best scientific journals, are not good science. Sometimes you can't tell because you don't know exactly how these studies were conducted. Sometimes I find this out indirectly. But I do a lot of reviewing. And I know that things get published that really aren't very well done, that really aren't giving the answers the authors think they're giving. It's a human endeavor. If it fits with somebody's idea about what should be, they'll overlook the limitations of the design because it fits.
All the more reason for having a round table with great diversity, pushing and prodding together into some kind of consensus, and then testing and refining and testing and refining.
Yeah.
So long as all of that doesn't lead to us thinking inside a lockbox.
Yeah. Absolutely. I know we get criticized by some people, the social constructionists, who say that science isn't the answer. That they just simply don't accept the science.
Generated, but it's certainly going to be telling us whether their answers were generated work.
Well, and there are some people that just really don't accept the validity of the scientific method. They're out there. There are a lot of them in education departments, unfortunately, but elsewhere as well. And, I don't know what to say to them. It's the only way I know of getting the answers, and it's not always perfect. Good scientists can fool themselves too. But it's better than not doing science in the long run.
It's certainly one of the lenses we must look through to avoid the self-deception that's in our nature.
Yeah. And science is really open to many different lenses of examination. I was saying earlier, genetics, fMRI imaging, methods of treatment, cognitive studies through psychology, social kinds of issues, teacher education. There's all of these things matter ultimately in terms of literacy levels within the country. And we just need to open our minds and say we have to consider all of these
You
things.
mentioned fMRI. I'll close with this one because this was interesting to me. On the one hand, we've got people like your work and Rainer's work, and I don't mean to say that I understand where the actual distinction is, but basically getting down to saying, look, on average, the difference, the phonological kind of pattern recognition image fire, sound image fire, virtual component constituents firing, 15, 20 milliseconds behind, graphemic recognition, visual recognition. I mean, it's like 5 milliseconds here, 20 milliseconds.
Very fast.
Very fast. If that doesn't happen fast enough, this whole assembly process chokes, breaks down, stutters out, and so forth. So on the one hand, it's very quick.
Yes,
faster
right.
than thought. So then I talk with people about fMRI, right? And there's such a certainty about what they think can be seen with this, and yet it cannot make differentiations in anywhere near the speed variations that on the other side over here we're saying are critical.
No, they acknowledge that. They know that. They're really trying to understand the functional architecture of the brain. And they're trying to say that certain regions in normal readers have this pattern of activity. Certain regions in disabled readers that are maybe different have a different pattern of activity. And then one of the things they're working on the most now is to see if you can change the pattern of activity by intervention. And the evidence is pretty good that you can.
Yeah.
In some sense, I would certainly expect learning to have some influence on activity in the brain. So in an overall sense, I'm not surprised at that. I wouldn't expect it in the liver, for example. But so it's in the brain, and the brain changes, as it must. You change the brain when you open your cabinet door.
You change the brain when you use it.
Right. But I think that there is something to be learned in addition, beyond that trivial, obvious point. The more we learn about different areas of the brain, how they become functionally active when you're not a skilled reader, when you are a skilled reader, it's another lens through which to look. It's another lens. I wouldn't recommend it as a way of diagnosing reading disability at this point. It's easier to give a reading test, but in terms of understanding how things change, as where in different parts of the brain there are changes going on, and there may be some interesting individual differences. They haven't looked much at that at this point because it's very expensive to do these scans, but probably there are some interesting individual differences. Dyslexia perhaps takes many different forms, and the functional anatomy of one dyslexic's brain may be quite different from another's, even if there's some averages that seem to be reliable. So I very much encourage research going in that direction as well as other directions.
And I do too.
Yeah.
The press has been picking up stuff like that as if it's this panaceic
understanding.
Right. And it's kind of like, being out in space and looking at the density of light patterns in San Francisco and Los Angeles, and saying, San Francisco's got more action going on at 2 a.m. than Los Angeles does. But that the particular behavior has to do with whether Federal Express is on time.
That's right. Yeah.
So, I mean...
That's right. And actually, this is an area where fMRI imaging is picking up in the marketplace. There's a local company that diagnoses ADHD by looking at fMRI scans. That's nonsense. I know. It's nonsense. There's no evidence to support that. There is some scientific research to show that on average, big groups of the kids with attention deficit disorder have somewhat of a different pattern of activation than those that don't. But it's much easier to diagnose it at a behavioral level, actually, the variability, and it's much less expensive. I mean, these fMRI scans are hugely expensive. So I'm always leery when I hear proposals, as I once heard a proposal from a prominent researcher, that we should put fMRI machines out in the schools to diagnose dyslexia. That's incredible. The cost of that technology is huge, and it's not a reliable diagnosis of dyslexia. There are kids with the average pattern of brain activity shown by a dyslexic group who are fine readers. And there are kids that are rather poor readers who show the average pattern of a good reader.
Well, again, if the frequency variation, if things are happening that fast, and we can only see a fuzzed out version of it, there's an aggregate time blur.
Well, there's actually technology now that's developing so they can look at both at the same time. They can get functional imaging us to show where these patterns are changing, where the activity is changing, and also what its timing is. They're really trying to combine both of these together. They're hugely expensive, as are twin studies, I'll have to admit, as I write my budget for the grant next week. But they're kind of our Hubble telescope, if you will, looking into human nature in a really important area. So I think that they deserve some funding. And in fact, they get a fraction of what really goes into educational research at this point. And maybe they should only get a fraction, because I think there's a lot of other things that, are really important to do in application out in the field that are also very expensive. But I think they deserve a place at the table.
Absolutely. I think everybody that's got, a distinct lens we need to look through it.
Yeah,
And see
that's
what
right.
we see when we look through it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Wonderful